how stupid do I have to be to believe in God? That's a good question, isn't it? And probably some of us have been asked that question already. And yeah, I have been asked that question already. So I have many thoughts about that. And we will have five parts of this session of about 20 minutes. First, about my institute, especially for German people, this is very interesting because most of our resources are in German, but there are some in English as well. Like our movies, they're all available in English as well in our Vimeo channel, if you know Vimeo. And then here you can see our website. And if you have questions to me personally, you can always write an email to info@iguw.de. IGUW.de means Institute für Glaube und Wissenschaft, Institute for Faith and Science, or not only science, but actually all the academic disciplines. In German, Wissenschaft is broader than just science. I'm a physicist by training, and I love to watch nature, to look into the sky. And this is just a little picture. But usually as physicists, of course, we try to categorize. So if I had produced or created the heavens, I would probably have done it that way, which would have been much easier to understand and to grasp for a physicist. Like how bright are the stars, how many of each brightness scale are there, and so on. But we can always come to that conclusion if we look at any part of our world, like in this famous movie Inception. Is that what we actually observe? Is it real? Are the stars real? Or are they just the product of a simulation? Someone who produces something for us and it's not the real thing. I think this movie is really marvelous in really making yourself think, well, where am I? Am I in a dream or am I in reality now? And what is more real, the dream or reality? And this is a big question also when it comes to the question, how stupid do you have to be to believe in God? But this is the overview for our meeting. 5 sessions. First, a question of worldview. Second, a question of argumentation, how to argue. Third, a question, is faith the opposite of reason? And fourth, reasons for a personal God. And fifth, reason for the Christian God. So let's come to the first question, a question of worldview. As it is about stupidity and intelligence, my first question is an IQ test. What do you think that is? I give you a little time and you can make up your mind and you will come up with different answers probably. Usually in the lecture theater, I get very interesting interpretations of that picture. And when I tell you the answer, some of you might say, oh, how stupid I am. Of course, it's clear what it is. It is a Mexican on a bike, riding on a bike, seen from above, and he has just bought a French bread, a French baguette. And so you see from above, very easy to understand. If you have not seen that, I don't know, maybe you are stupid. It really depends on the perspective, of course. What is this if you see that picture? This should be much easier now. You see a lot of circles. You see a square. Taking into account that I love Mexicans, you might have an idea already about this. This is a Mexican celebrating his PhD, his successful completion of his PhD with 35 Mexican friends who all wear their Mexican hats, seen from above again. So you see, when you are in the right context, you will get the right answer. So what is stupidity and intelligence all about? I would say it is very closely connected to truth. What is truth and how can we find truth? What is the truth behind these pictures? And maybe some of you sometimes come to weigh how much they weigh and they step on the scales. And of course, you can apply this trick and just put your calculating machine on top of the display and type in any number you want, like 45 kilogram. That's fine, isn't it? Well, The problem is, if you do that, a lot of people will tell you you are stupid, because why do you step on the scales when you actually don't want to see the truth about your weight? And so usually what we say is a person who lives according to truth and in accordance with reality behaves in the right way, is wise, and someone who lives against truth is stupid. And here we come already to a first response to the question, how stupid do you have to be to believe in God? Well, if you believe that reality means there is no God and there are no good reasons to believe in God because it's just an ancient fairy tale, then of course you will answer you are stupid if you believe in God. But if you know a lot of good reasons why there is a God and why God is actually the truth, then of course you would say it's actually stupid not to believe in that God. So we see stupidity is actually a bad characteristics and you should never use it yourself, I suggest, to classify someone. Because if someone tells you you are stupid, that is a challenge. Are you living in reality? And the challenge goes back, in which reality does the other person actually live? So how can we know what is truth? Well, usually we try to find out about truth by realization of the world in which we live. We process perceptions. Well, we sit here at the table, like Calvin here, trying to figure out what he actually has to eat today. So we perceive material properties. For example, a physical stimulus. We see our food in front of us on the plate and we hear maybe the sounds it makes when we take our fork and muddle it up and so on. And then we process our stimuli with our sensory organs, and they pass on electrical currents in our brain and so on. And then something mysterious happens, which we can hardly understand with scientific methods, because we create something like an inner image. We connect the signals that have been passed on to us by our sensory equipment, and we have some imagination, some association. We connect it to memories and so on. We have an inner image and connect it to an abstract term. Usually, we use words to describe. Like, is it pasta? Is it pizza? Whatever Calvin has to eat here. So we abstract a form or an idea from matter. And maybe we also judge what we have to eat. Is it good food or is it bad food? And so a lot of what we interpret can be even ambiguous. Yeah. Someone will say, I love pizza. It's the greatest picture I ever had. Someone else might say, this is the worst food I ever had. And I even don't know whether that is pizza that I have in front of me. So it can be ambiguous and people might have different opinions on what we perceive. But physical truth is not the only way, it's not the only kind of truth that we discover in reality. Physical truth would be connected very much to experience things. So empiricism says that all truth is physical truth, things that we can empirically verify. In this case, it's always important that we never have direct access to this kind of truth, because it's always via perception. And of course, perception can be deceived. We can have misperceptions, like in a Fata Morgana, for example. So we only have indirect access to the real world around us via our sensory instruments of our body. And so to find out whether Earth is flat, we need to do measurements, and we need to find out, do we interpret the measurements in the right way, and so on. A second category of truth is metaphysical truth. Logic would be the instrument, like logical reasoning. A is not the opposite of A, for example, because A is identical with A, so A can't be the opposite of A. We have direct access to that via reason. So we do not have to have any sensory experiences or anything, but we have direct access to logics. 1 + 1 is 2, something that is self-evident somehow to us if we know about mathematics. And then we have a third category, and that's moral truth, like value judgments. Someone says this is good or it's bad. Should I pay taxes? Is tax paying good or is it bad? And so we judge according to moral authority, and our instrument is actually conscience, like our intuition, whether something is good and correct to do or whether something is bad. And fourth, there are relational truths. I can know all three other categories about a person, but I still need to make a decision, will I trust that person or not? And I will only know that by acquaintance, for example. But this does not only refer to another person, it also refers to propositions. If someone tells me outside it rains, I can either trust that proposition or I don't trust that proposition. Okay, so 4 different kinds of truths, and we need to be aware that when we think someone is stupid, it might have to do of different truths that we believe are true with regard to these 4 categories, for example. Truth in a philosophical sense, so basically in the logical sense, is defined as the correspondence of a proposition with its referring statement of affairs. Like I say something about something, and the words that I use do actually correspond to the truth out there. For example, I can say when I look at that soccer field, there is mud on the soccer field, and that's the objective truth. Everyone can experience that if they go and play soccer on that soccer field. But then there is the subjective truth with not with capital T, but with small t. And this would be, I like playing soccer in the mud. Not everyone would agree with that, but that's how I react personally according to my values and my inclinations to that objective truth. So there are some things that are objectively true and other things that are only subjectively true and where we can have different opinions, even though the reality out there is the same. And you can also apply that to faith in God. There is a God. People can agree or disagree with that. And then, do I like there to be a God or don't I like to be there a God? And all this has to do with my personal worldview and perception of reality. This is a very famous experiment that has been done with psychology students. How old is this lady? And some of you will say, well, this lady is 60 or 80 years old. Others of you might say, well, this is only a 30 or 20 years old lady. But in this case, I can assure you, if you say this is a young lady, you are wrong. This is definitely an old lady. In this case, you are both right, because this lady can be a young lady or an old lady. And so in this experiment, psychology students have been separated, divided into 2 groups. One group was trained with the left picture, and the other group was trained with the right picture. And after that, they were brought together in a room where they could hear each other, but there was a wall between the 2 groups, and they had to discuss on the picture in the middle. And so they had to talk about that picture, and a lot of misunderstandings came out of that. Of course, no wonder, because they were trained to perceive that picture in a certain way. And the problem is, in the middle picture, you can see the old and the young lady, but they look in different directions, the nose is in a different position, and so on. And what we learn about that from that experiment is that our worldview shapes very much our perception and also filters our perception. People who were trained with the right picture will always see the young lady first, and only after a long discussion they will realize, actually, you are right, it could be an old lady too. Inconsistencies and ambiguities are usually filtered out. And that teaches us something. When someone tells us you are stupid if you believe in God, then he might come from a different picture with which he was trained all of his life. And we need to actually find out from which picture that person is coming. Otherwise, we will have no chance to have a meaningful conversation with that person. And we need to help that person actually to see the world from a different perspective. Just to give you an historical example, this is Francis Crick, a very famous geneticist. He got the Nobel Prize for discovering the DNA structure in 1953. And he's an atheist. He says the simple fables of the religious people of the world have come to seem like tales told to children. There is no God in his view, in his perception of the world, and he discovers DNA, and for him that is even a proof that there cannot be a God, because we have understood the mechanism on which the human body is actually produced in nature. Another very famous geneticist, also Francis, but Francis Collins, living much later, he was the director of the Human Genome Project, who published the Human Genome in the year 2000. And he says, it is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God. So they have made actually very similar discoveries with intriguing scientific projects and thoughts. Both are very intelligent from a scientific point of view. He has not yet received the Nobel Prize, but of course he's a candidate for that. And he's persuaded that there is a God, and the DNA is just the instruction book that God has actually produced in order that our body is built. Very similar discoveries, but very different perspectives or interpretations. So there are leading scientists who believe in God and others who are atheists or agnostics. It doesn't seem to be a matter of science or of intelligence, actually, whether you believe in God or not. There can be stupid people believing in God, and there can be intelligent people believing in God and not believing in God. Both can be the case. So it's not about science or intelligence versus faith in God, but actually it's a matter of worldviews. Worldview 1 against worldview 2. So the worldview question would be, what is the reason for everything that exists? Is there a God, or is it just chance and necessity? And in this case, we have two different worldviews. One is theism. Theism believes that spirit is eternal and primary, and the eternal spirit actually created by whatever means matter. On the other hand, we have materialism or atheism, which says, well, there is matter is eternal, and matter actually is primary, and spirit or mind is just a late phenomenon that happens if matter takes a complex construction or composition, and then spirit or mind can emerge from material processes by emergence, so to say, which is a complex scientific mechanism, so to say, which is hardly defined actually. So two completely different worldviews. And of course, when you are an adherent of theism, you believe there is a God. If you're an adherent of materialism, you believe there is no God. And there are many more worldviews. There's pantheism, for example, which would say that that everything somehow is God, and God unfolds himself or themselves in material processes. So even a stone, every piece of matter is part of God. That's pantheism. Pan means everything in Greek, so everything is God. There is polytheism, like the Greeks and the Romans, many different gods, and they don't necessarily like each other. There is monotheism, which says there is just one God. And there are different versions of that, of course, if you think about Islam, Judaism, and Christian monotheism, which is actually a Trinitarianism. And then there is deism. Deism says, well, yes, there is a God, but this God does not interfere with nature anymore. This God just created the world, but then let it run and does not interfere. There's materialism, which says, well, if deism is true, then of course, why do we need God in the first place? Everything runs on its own, and if matter is eternal, we don't even need God anymore. Nihilism, existentialism, relativism, agnosticism, and so on. Agnosticism means we cannot know whether there is a God, and we will never be able to know about that. So many different isms. And these isms always answer a set of basic questions, worldview questions, and every ism makes truth claims. Claims that things are real, what they believe. giving answers to these questions. For example, the question of reality. What is ultimate reality like? Is it matter, energy, spirit, mind, God, personal? What is the origin? Where do we come from? What is a human being? The question of mankind. What is the meaning of our life? To what purpose are we here? Very important question for every worldview. The question of history. Where does history lead to? Is history linear or is it actually circular, that the same things happen again and again? The question about destiny. What happens after death, like personal destiny compared to historical destiny of all of mankind and world history? Will I live on after my personal death? What is my personal destiny? And then moral. What is good? What is bad? What should I do and what should I not do? And the question of knowledge. What can we know and with which certainty can we know things? And when you compare worldviews uh, with their response to these questions, you will always be able to find commonalities. As a Christian, you will find commonalities, for example, in knowledge with an atheist. An atheist will claim we can know truth and truth is matter, materialism. As a Christian, we will say, yes, I agree completely that we can know truth, but I believe the truth is personal. The truth is not matter and impersonal. It's personal. So we have commonalities and we have differences. And if we want to have a meaningful discussion with someone who has a different worldview, it's important to ask these questions so that before we get into a conflict and have an angry discussion with someone, we first get to know what do we actually believe, and that we find out that actually all of us are interested in finding out what is reality, and we have common ground on which we can stand. Let's find out what truth is. And I think this is a very important principle, not only for a Christian, but actually we see what happens in our societies today. If we don't follow to listen to each other, what is our worldview and why do we believe what we believe, we will end up in a very polarized and hostile world, because we say, you say this is wrong, I hate you for that. And that's what we see in the social media wherever you look. And this is why we have a polarized world. If we ask questions why people believe what they believe and how they answer these different questions, our world would be much better and we can understand each other. And we have actually a road to find out why some beliefs might be better grounded in reality than other beliefs, because there might be facts that we have to take into account and logical arguments. So, just to exchange our thoughts about worldviews will not be enough to listen to what someone says, but we need to test our worldview beliefs. We need to ask questions, and there are three basic tests. Test number one is consistency. Is the worldview that I hold inherently contradicting? For example, in relativism, if I say my basic worldview says everything is relative, then I can ask, so if everything is relative, what about that very statement itself? If everything is relative, then also this statement is relative. So there could be absolute truths. Or your statement is not true itself, of course. So we see there are some worldviews that have a problem in themselves. They are self-contradictory. And that's why I didn't even mention relativism, because I think at the very heart, most relativists are not really relativists, because they realize that this worldview is self-contradictory. Other worldviews are not self-contradictory, but you can hold them, but they have maybe problems with correspondency. Correspondency, that means, does the worldview fit with our perceived reality? For example, if I claim that stones are actually conscious beings, they have some form of consciousness, then my question would be, what is the proof? What is the evidence that a stone can actually think and has a will and a basic elementary consciousness and so on? There are people who believe that. And the problem is they can hardly give any evidence for that, because stones just lie there and they only move if something else moves the stones. And they never say something is good or bad. So I would say that there is a very weak evidence, a weak argument to be made that stones have consciousness. Like some pantheistic people would say that and claim that. So that's a second test, correspondency. Does your worldview fit perceived reality? And then there is a third test, practicability. Can you actually live out the worldview you believe? For example, if you are a materialist and you say, well, you know what happened recently? I've fallen in love and I really love this girl so much. She's the most beautiful girl in my life and I give up everything in my life just to love her. And then I can always ask, so what do you mean by love? You are a materialist, so you believe that even our own self is nothing but our neurons firing and our hormone levels changing. What is love in your view? And what do you mean by laying down your life for that beautiful girl and so on? Don't you think that love is maybe more than just hormone levels? You even don't need that girl in order to experience that. You could even take medicine or chemical drugs in order to increase your hormone level and get the same feelings maybe. So what's the difference between getting chemicals and having the same experience and really standing next to that person and wanting to hug her and love her and so on? So it is hard to live out a material a purely materialistic worldview, I would say, because we realize our human experience points to something greater than just material processes. And then a question that I personally love to ask everyone whom I meet and get into discussion with is one question, and that is, what would have to happen in order to change my worldview? In order to change your worldview? Like, is there something that if you say, if that happens in my life, I think I will completely change my life? And it's also good to ask that question to yourself, of course. And we can talk about that at the end of this masterclass, what I would answer about that, for example. Okay. A person who actually was very famous for being an atheist is the philosopher Antony Flew. And he wrote a book, There Is No God, crossed out the no, and writing down, There is a God. And this was very surprising because in the 80s and 90s, he did not shrink back from any discussion and debate with any Christian philosopher in order to prove there is no God. Their atheism is the true worldview. But then in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, he changed his mind, interestingly. And he writes in this book on page 88, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. So by a personal being, by a personal God, actually. Why do I believe that? Well, this is the world picture as I see it that has emerged from modern science. Very interestingly, he argues with science and not with the Bible. First, the fact that nature obeys laws. So this is one argument he presents. Second, the dimension of life, intelligently organized and purpose-driven beings. And third, the very existence of nature. Why is there something rather than nothing? And he says we must follow the argument wherever it leads, as the philosopher Plato said. And so he says, this is my basic principle in life. And up to now, I thought that to follow the evidence means, or to follow the argument means actually to follow atheism. But then he says, now I have changed my mind because of several interesting discoveries in modern science. So he gives reasons why he has changed his worldview from atheism to theism. He did not yet become a Christian, even though a friend of mine who got to know him personally in this journey reported that in his final years, he has died already, in his final years, he even attended a Baptist church sometimes and went to church. And he was humble enough to do that. And not to say, I've always hated to go to church. No, he says, well, I follow evidence wherever it leads, interestingly. So this is the end of my first chapter, actually. This llama will also always indicate now it's for you to digest and to chew